The thunder of hooves was all but drowned by the pounding of Nora Matthews' heart as she pushed her exhausted mare to its limits. The small bundle clutched tightly against her chest, burning with fever. Sweetwater, Arizona Territory, 1883, was still little more than a distant cluster of buildings on the horizon, and every moment counted in the race to save her son's life. "Hold on, Billy," she whispered, her voice breaking as she felt the heat radiating through the blanket. "Just hold on a little longer." The 5-year-old's only response was a weak moan, his small face flushed with fever that had spiked alarmingly through the night. 3 days of caring for him alone at their isolated homestead had brought no improvement, and when Billy had started struggling to breathe before dawn, Nora had known she couldn't wait any longer. The 20-mile ride to town was their only hope. Sweetwater was growing larger now, the main street visible as her horse stumbled down the hill toward the town. Nora's vision blurred with tears of exhaustion and fear. What if she was too late? What if Dr. Henderson wasn't in town? The questions tormented her as she urged her failing mount forward. The mare was stumbling badly now, foam flecking its muzzle as they finally reached the outskirts of town. Saturday morning meant the streets were crowded wagons, horses, and townspeople, creating a nearly impassable maze between her and the doctor's office at the far end of the thoroughfare. "Please," she called out weakly, but her voice was lost in the bustle of the busy main street. "I need help," her horse faltered, nearly going down on its knees, and Nora felt despair washing over her. Then, like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known she was saying, a commanding voice cut through the noise. "Stand aside. Make way." The crowd parted as a tall, broad-shouldered man on a powerful black stallion rode toward her. His dark Stetson shaded piercing blue eyes in a sun-weathered face, and in one fluid motion, he was beside her, strong hands steadying her as her mare finally gave out. "The child needs a doctor," Nora gasped, clutching Billy closer. Without hesitation, the stranger lifted them, both mother and child, onto his horse. "Hold on," he instructed, his voice deep and steady as he turned his mount and called out again. "Clear a path, sick child coming through." People scattered before them, and Nora felt a surge of gratitude as they galloped down the street toward the doctor's office. The stranger's arm was strong around her waist, keeping her and Billy secure as they rode. "Name's Jake Turner," he said over his shoulder. "Just rode in from Colorado Territory. What's ailing your boy? Fever, cough. He can't breathe right," Nora managed, feeling Billy's labored breaths against her. "I'm Nora Matthews. My husband's been gone 3 years. It's just us at the homestead west of town." Jake nodded, his jaw set with determination as he guided his horse to a halt in front of a whitewashed building with Dr. Henderson, physician, painted on the window. Before Nora could move, he had dismounted and lifted her and Billy gently to the ground. "Dr. Henderson." He called, pushing open the door and ushering Nora inside. "Emergency here." The next hours passed in a blur for Nora. Dr. Henderson diagnosed Billy with severe pneumonia, his weathered face grave as he prepared medicines and hot compresses. Jake Turner never left, fetching water, building up the fire in the office stove, and offering quiet support that Nora hadn't known she needed until it was there. By nightfall, Billy's fever had broken slightly, though the doctor warned they weren't out of danger yet. "He needs constant care for the next few days," Dr. Henderson said, wiping his spectacles with a handkerchief. "I can't let you take him back to your homestead, Mrs. Matthews. He needs to stay here in town where I can monitor him." Nora's heart sank. I don't have money for a hotel room," she admitted, the shame of her poverty washing over her. The drought had ruined last year's crop, and what little savings they'd had was long gone. "You'll stay at the boarding house," Jake said firmly, speaking for the first time in hours. "I've already spoken to Mrs. Holloway. She has a room ready for you and your boy." "But I can't." "You can and you will," he interrupted, his expression brooking no argument. "Consider it a loan if your pride demands it, but that boy needs rest and care, and you look about ready to collapse yourself." There was something in his eyes, a blend of kindness and quiet authority, that silenced her protests. Too exhausted to argue further, Nora could only nod her gratitude as Jake carefully lifted Billy, now sleeping under the influence of the doctor's medicine. The walk to Mrs. Holloway's boarding house was mercifully short. The matronly woman showed them to a clean, simple room with a double bed and a small cot. "I'll bring up some broth for the boy when he wakes," she said kindly. "And you look like you could use a meal yourself, Mrs. Matthews." After she left, Nora turned to Jake, who was gently laying Billy on the bed. "Why are you helping us?" she asked, the question that had been burning in her mind finally finding voice. "You don't even know us." Jake straightened, and in the lamplight, she noticed for the first time the faint scar that ran along his jawline, the lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and hardship. "My sister and her boy died of fever 3 winters ago," he said simply. "I wasn't there to help them. But I'm here now and you needed help." He moved toward the door. "Get some rest, Mrs. Matthews. I'll check on you both tomorrow." Before she could respond, he was gone, his boot steps fading down the hallway. Nora sank onto the edge of the bed beside Billy, brushing damp hair from his forehead. His breathing was still labored, but less desperate than before. For the first time since he'd fallen ill, she allowed herself to believe he might recover. And as exhaustion finally claimed her, her last thought was of kind blue eyes and the strange twist of fate that had brought Jake Turner into their lives just when they needed him most. The next morning, Nora woke to sunlight streaming through the curtains and the unfamiliar sound of town life below the window. For a moment, disorientation gripped her, then memory flooded back as she turned quickly to Billy. Her son's eyes were open, still glazed with fever but more alert than they had been in days. "Mama," he whispered, his voice raspy. "I'm here, sweetheart." Tears of relief stung her eyes as she pressed a kiss to his forehead. The fever was still present but noticeably lower. "How do you feel?" "Thirsty," Billy managed, and Nora quickly poured water from the pitcher on the bedside table. As she helped him sip, a gentle knock sounded at the door. Expecting Mrs. Holloway, Nora called, "Come in," only to find Jake Turner standing in the doorway, hat in hand and a small wooden horse carved in his other. "Thought the young man might like something to keep him company while he heals," Jake said, a touch of uncertainty in his normally confident manner. Billy's eyes widened at the sight of the toy, and Jake approached the bed, placing it carefully in the boy's small hands. "Carved it myself last night," he explained. "Nothing fancy, but it's perfect," Nora interrupted, touched beyond words by the thoughtful gesture. "Thank you, Mr. Turner." "Jake," he corrected with a slight smile. "Mr. Turner was my father, and he was a much more respectable man than I'll ever be." The self-deprecating humor brought an answering smile to Nora's lips. "Jake, then, and I'm Nora, not Mrs. Matthews." A moment of understanding passed between them, broken only when Dr. Henderson arrived to examine Billy. The news was cautiously optimistic. The boy was responding to treatment, but would need at least a week of rest before he could be moved. "Which brings us to your homestead," Jake said after the doctor left. "You mentioned you're alone out there." Nora nodded, a new worry creasing her brow. "The livestock, my milk cow and chickens, they need tending, and the garden." The thought of losing what little they had made her stomach knot with anxiety. "I'll ride out and see to them," Jake offered immediately. "I couldn't ask. You didn't ask. I offered." The firmness in his tone brooked no argument. "Just give me directions. I can handle a cow and some chickens, and whatever else needs doing." Nora studied him, this stranger who had already done more for her family than anyone since Robert had died. "Why would you do that? You must have your own business in town." Jake shrugged, his broad shoulders shifting beneath his worn shirt. "Nothing that can't wait. Truth is, I came to Sweetwater looking for a fresh start. Seems helping you might be part of that start." There was something in his eyes, a shadow of old pain, perhaps that resonated with Nora's own losses. She found herself nodding. "The homestead is about 20 miles west, just beyond Cottonwood Creek. You can't miss it. There's a lightning-struck oak near the turnoff from the main trail." "I'll find it," he assured her, "and I'll bring back anything you need from the house." Before he left, Jake arranged for meals to be brought up from the boarding house kitchen and asked the general store to send over clean clothes for both Nora and Billy. "Put it on my account," she overheard him saying to the delivery boy. Her pride warred with her need, but for Billy's sake, she accepted the help. 3 years of struggling alone had taught her that sometimes pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. Over the next days, a routine developed. Jake rode out to the homestead each morning, returning by late afternoon with news of her animals and property. He brought fresh eggs, milk, and vegetables from her garden, along with small treasures he thought might cheer Billy: interesting rocks, a bird's feather, once even a turtle that kept the boy entertained for hours before Jake returned it to the creek. Billy's recovery was steady, his natural resilience asserting itself with each passing day. By the 4th day, he was sitting up in bed, eagerly awaiting Jake's return and the stories the cowboy would tell of adventures across the territories. "Did you really fight a bear?" Billy asked one evening, his eyes wide with wonder as Jake described an encounter in the Colorado mountains. "Well, fight might be putting it too strongly," Jake chuckled, sitting on the edge of the bed. "More like I backed away very slowly while trying not to make any sudden movements or soil my trousers." Nora laughed despite herself, and Jake glanced up, a warmth in his eyes that made something flutter in her chest. It had been so long since she'd laughed, so long since there had been another adult to share the simple joy of her son's enthusiasm. "Your mama's got a pretty laugh," Jake said to Billy, though his eyes stayed on Nora. "Don't reckon I've heard it enough." A blush heated her cheeks as she busied herself with folding the clean laundry Mrs. Holloway had brought up. "There hasn't been much cause for laughter lately," she admitted. "Then we'll have to find some causes," Jake replied, his voice gentle. "Life's too short not to find reasons to laugh, even when times are hard." That night, after Billy had fallen asleep and Jake had returned to his room at the saloon where he was staying, Nora stood by the window looking out at the stars. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to think not just of survival, but of possibilities. Of laughter and companionship, and the way Jake's eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. It was dangerous thinking. She knew that. Jake Turner was a drifter by his own admission, a man passing through on his way to something else. And yet, she touched the glass, cool beneath her fingertips. And yet, for the first time since Robert's death, she found herself wondering what it might be like to not be alone. By the end of the week, Dr. Henderson declared Billy well enough to return home, though he cautioned that the boy would need continued rest and care. "The fever's gone, but his lungs are still healing," he warned Nora. "No strenuous activities for at least another week and keep him warm." Jake was there when the doctor delivered the news, and Nora saw something flicker across his face: relief, certainly, but also something that might have been regret. "I'll arrange for a wagon to take you both back tomorrow," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "The trail's too rough for the boy to ride horseback just yet." "Thank you," Nora said, equally careful, "for everything. I don't know how we would have managed without your help." Jake nodded, his eyes meeting hers briefly before he turned to Billy. "How about one more story before you head home, young man?" As Jake spun a tale about wild mustangs, Nora packed their few belongings, her mind racing. Tomorrow they would return to the homestead, to the isolation and endless work. And Jake Turner would move on, as men like him always did. The thought left an unexpected hollow feeling in her chest. The next morning dawned clear and cool, a perfect late spring day. Jake appeared with a rented wagon, the back lined with hay and blankets to make a comfortable bed for Billy. He helped them in, his hands lingering briefly on Nora's waist as he lifted her to the seat. "Got everything?" he asked, his voice gruff. Nora nodded, unable to trust her own voice. After a week of his constant presence, the impending separation felt strangely like another loss. The journey passed mostly in silence, broken only by Billy's occasional excited comments about returning home and seeing his animals. Nora could feel Jake beside her, solid and steady as he handled the team, but there was a new distance between them that had nothing to do with physical space. When they crested the final hill and the homestead came into view, Nora gasped. The small cabin looked different. The sagging porch had been repaired, the roof patched where winter storms had damaged it, and the yard was neatly cleared of debris. "Jake, did you?" He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "Had some time on my hands, figured you had enough to worry about without coming home to repairs that needed doing." Tears pricked at Nora's eyes. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. Not looking for repayment, he said quietly. Just wanted to help. As they pulled into the yard, Nora saw more evidence of Jake's work: firewood stacked neatly by the door, the garden weeded and thriving, even the chicken coop had been reinforced against predators. You've done so much, she whispered, overwhelmed by the enormity of his kindness. Jake finally looked at her then, something vulnerable in his expression. Nora, Mr. Jake fixed my swing too, Mama, Billy interrupted, pointing to the old rope swing that hung from the oak tree. It had been broken for months, the rope frayed beyond safety. The moment between them shattered, Jake cleared his throat and jumped down to help Billy from the wagon. Let's get you settled inside, partner. Your mama needs rest too, after all that worrying she did over you. The inside of the cabin was equally transformed, clean, organized, with fresh wildflowers in a jar on the table and a pot of something savory simmering on the stove. Thought you might be hungry after the ride, Jake explained, suddenly seeming uncomfortable in the small space. It's just rabbit stew, nothing fancy. It's perfect, Nora said, the simple domesticity of the scene bringing a lump to her throat. How long had it been since someone had cooked for her? After settling Billy in his bed with strict instructions to rest, Nora returned to the main room to find Jake standing awkwardly by the door, hat in hand. I should be getting back to town, he said. Let you both get settled in. Panic fluttered in Nora's chest. You're leaving so soon. Got some business to attend to, he said vaguely. But I'll check in on you both in a day or two if that's all right. It wasn't what she wanted to hear, but Nora nodded, forcing a smile. Of course. We've imposed on your kindness long enough. Jake looked as if he wanted to say more, but instead he simply placed his hat on his head with a nod. Take care of yourself, Nora Matthews, and that fine boy of yours. And then he was gone, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the afternoon stillness. Nora stood in the doorway long after he'd disappeared from sight, a strange emptiness settling over her despite being home at last. Only when Billy called for water did she shake herself from her thoughts and return to the familiar rhythms of caring for her son and their home. But as she moved through the evening chores, she found reminders of Jake everywhere: in the repaired furniture, the organized shelves, even in the way the kindling was arranged by the fireplace for maximum efficiency. He'd left his mark on their lives in more ways than she could count. Night fell, and after tucking Billy in, Nora sat alone on the porch steps, looking up at the vast canopy of stars. The silence of the homestead, once a peaceful respite, now felt oppressive after the bustle of town and the steady presence of Jake Turner. Don't be a fool, she whispered to herself. He was just being kind to a woman and child in need. Nothing more. But as she finally went inside to her cold, empty bed, Nora couldn't quite convince her heart to believe what her head was saying. 3 days passed with no sign of Jake. Nora tried to focus on Billy's continued recovery and the many tasks around the homestead, but found herself pausing often to scan the horizon, hoping to see a rider approaching. On the 4th day, she was hanging laundry when Billy, who had been permitted to sit on the porch in the sunshine, suddenly called out, "Mama, someone's coming." Her heart leapt. But as she turned toward the trail, she saw not one rider but 3, and none of them was Jake Turner. "Billy, go inside," she said sharply, recognizing the lead rider as Frank Sawyer, a local rancher who had been pressuring her to sell the homestead since Robert's death. The men with him were his ranch hands, rough characters who made Nora uncomfortable whenever she encountered them in town. "Mrs. Matthews," Sawyer called jovially as they rode into the yard. "Looking mighty fine today, if I may say so." Nora didn't return his smile. "What brings you out this way, Mr. Sawyer?" He dismounted, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Just being neighborly." "Heard your boy was sick, thought I'd check in." "He's recovering, thank you," Nora replied stiffly. "As you can see," Sawyer's eyes took in the repaired porch, the well-maintained yard. "Place is looking better than last time I rode by. Seems you've had some help." His tone suggested he knew exactly who had been helping her. "I manage," Nora said, conscious of Billy watching from inside the cabin window. "Now if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." "Always working, that's your problem." Sawyer took a step closer, and Nora caught the smell of whiskey on his breath despite the early hour. A pretty woman like you shouldn't be out here alone, breaking her back on land that's barely worth the effort. This land is our home, Nora said firmly. And as I've told you before, it's not for sale. Sawyer's friendly facade slipped, his expression hardening. Be reasonable, woman. You can't run this place alone, and my offer is more than fair. With that money, you could set yourself up in town, find a proper husband instead of taking charity from drifters. The implied slight against Jake made Nora's temper flare. Mr. Turner is a friend who kindly helped us in a difficult time, and what I do or don't do is none of your concern. It becomes my concern when you're sitting on land I need for my cattle operation, Sawyer snapped, his patience clearly wearing thin. Water rights in this territory aren't something to take lightly, especially with Cottonwood Creek running through your property. So that was it, not the land itself, but the water that made her small homestead valuable. Nora stood straighter, gathering her courage. My husband filed legal claim to this land and its water. I suggest you respect that claim, Mr. Sawyer. For a moment, something dangerous flashed in the rancher's eyes. Then he smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. Claims can be challenged, Mrs. Matthews, especially when a property isn't being properly worked. Might be worth considering my offer before things get complicated. The threat hung in the air between them. Nora was acutely aware of being alone, miles from town, with three men who clearly didn't have her best interests at heart. I think you should leave now, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Sawyer replaced his hat slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. Think on what I said, Mrs. Matthews. I'll be back in a week for your answer. For your boy's sake, I hope it's the right one. With that, he remounted his horse and gestured to his men. They rode away, but not before one of them knocked over her laundry basket, sending the clean clothes spilling into the dust. Once they were out of sight, Nora's legs gave way, and she sank onto the porch steps, trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. Billy emerged from the cabin, his small face pinched with worry. Mama, are those bad men going to come back? Nora pulled him into a fierce hug. Don't worry about them, sweetheart. Everything's going to be fine. But as she gathered the soiled laundry to rewash, she wasn't sure she believed her own reassurances. Frank Sawyer was a powerful man in the territory, with money and influence she couldn't hope to match. And if he was determined to have her land, what chance did she really have of stopping him? For the first time, she truly understood how vulnerable they were and how much she had come to depend on Jake Turner's steady presence, despite knowing him for such a short time. That night, after Billy was asleep, Nora took out Robert's old revolver from its hiding place in the root cellar. She checked it carefully, making sure it was loaded and in working order, then placed it within easy reach of her bed. Whatever happened, she would protect her son and their home. She had to. The next morning dawned with an unexpected sound, wagon wheels and the low voices of men. Nora reached for the revolver, her heart pounding, then nearly collapsed with relief when she recognized Jake Turner's deep voice calling a greeting. She rushed outside, not caring that she was still in her nightdress with only a shawl hastily thrown over her shoulders. Jake was climbing down from a loaded wagon, and beside him was another man older, with silver-streaked dark hair and the weathered look of a longtime rancher. Nora, Jake said, his eyes lighting up at the sight of her before taking in her disheveled appearance with concern. Everything all right? Now it is, she said honestly, suddenly conscious of her inappropriate attire. Let me get dressed. Please come inside when you're ready. Minutes later, properly attired and with her hair hastily pinned up, Nora emerged from her bedroom to find Jake and the older man sitting at her kitchen table, while Billy chattered excitedly about the items being unloaded from the wagon. Nora, this is Henry Blackwood, Jake introduced. He owns the Circle B Ranch about 40 miles east of here. Henry, this is Mrs. Nora Matthews and her son Billy. The older man stood, offering a weathered hand. Madam, heard a lot about you from this young man. He seems to think the sun rises and sets on you and your boy. Jake looked uncomfortable at this direct assessment, but didn't deny it. Henry's an old friend, worked his ranch when I first came west before I got the wandering itch. Pleased to meet you, Mr. Blackwood, Nora said, still trying to process Jake's return and the unexpected guest. "May I offer you coffee?" As she prepared the coffee, Jake explained that he'd gone to see his friend after leaving the homestead. Henry's looking to expand his operation, but not in cattle. He's interested in starting an orchard, and I remembered that south slope on your property, the one with good drainage and protection from the north wind. Nora stilled, the coffee pot halfway to the table. "My land, but I'm not selling." "Not selling," Henry clarified quickly. "Partnering." "If you'd be amenable." Over the next hour, Henry Blackwood laid out a proposal that left Nora's head spinning. He wanted to lease 10 acres of her land that was currently unused to plant apple and pear trees. In exchange, he would provide capital for improvements to the entire homestead, a guaranteed market for any crops she grew, and most importantly, his considerable influence in territorial matters. "I understand Frank Sawyer's been making things difficult," Henry said, his weathered face serious. "He and I have history. If you're under my protection, so to speak, he'll think twice before causing trouble." "It's a good deal, Nora," Jake added quietly. "I wouldn't have brought Henry here if I didn't think so." Nora looked between the two men, suspicion warring with hope. "Why would you do this, Mr. Blackwood? You don't know me." Henry glanced at Jake, a knowing look passing between them. "Let's just say I trust Jake's judgment, and I've been looking to diversify my holdings for some time. This arrangement would benefit us both." There was more to it than that, Nora was certain, but the proposal itself was sound. With Henry Blackwood's backing, she could make the homestead truly profitable, provide security for Billy, and most importantly, keep their land. "I'd need time to consider," she said finally. "Of course," Henry agreed. "I'll be in Sweetwater for the next 2 weeks, no rush on your decision." After breakfast, Henry excused himself to examine the south slope more carefully, leaving Nora and Jake alone in the kitchen while Billy supervised the unloading of supplies from the wagon. "You did this for us," Nora said softly. "You went to your friend specifically to help us with Sawyer." Jake didn't deny it. "Heard in town he's been pressuring you. Henry's a good man and his offer is genuine. But yes, I thought it might solve more than one problem. Why do you care so much?" Nora asked, the question that had been burning in her since he first helped them in town. Jake looked away, his profile strong against the morning light streaming through the window. "Told you about my sister. What I didn't say was that I could have been there for her, but I wasn't. I was too busy drifting, too restless to put down roots anywhere." His voice roughened. "By the time I got her letter about the fever, she and my nephew were already gone." "I'm so sorry," Nora whispered, understanding now the shadow she'd sometimes seen in his eyes when he looked at Billy. "After that, I just kept moving. Easier than staying anywhere long enough to care again." He finally looked at her, his blue eyes intense. "Until I saw you riding into Sweetwater with your sick boy, looking like the whole world was on your shoulders and you were determined to carry it anyway." The simple honesty in his words stripped away any pretense between them. Nora found herself moving closer, drawn by something she couldn't name. "And now," she asked, "are you still just passing through?" Jake's hand came up to touch her cheek, so gently she might have imagined it. "That depends on whether there's a reason to stay." The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Then Billy burst through the door, his excitement about the wagon's contents breaking the spell. Jake stepped back, the warmth in his eyes replaced by his usual calm demeanor. "Let's see what Henry thinks of that slope, shall we?" The next days were a whirlwind of activity. Henry Blackwood, satisfied with his examination of the property, drew up formal papers for their partnership. Men from his ranch arrived to begin clearing the south slope for the future orchard. And Jake stayed on, helping with repairs to the barn and other structures that had suffered from neglect during Nora's years of struggling alone. The homestead was suddenly full of life and purpose again. Billy thrived with so many people around, his health improving rapidly as he followed Jake from task to task, soaking up knowledge about horses, carpentry, and 100 other subjects. Nora found herself watching them together, Jake's patient explanations, Billy's rapt attention with a bittersweet ache in her heart. This was what her son had missed without a father, what she hadn't been able to provide despite her best efforts. In the evenings, when the work was done and Billy was asleep, Nora and Jake would sit on the porch, talking quietly under the stars. He told her of his years wandering the territories, of the beauty he'd seen and the loneliness he'd never acknowledged until now. She shared stories of her life with Robert, their dreams for the homestead, and the desperate struggle to keep going after his death. "You're the strongest person I've ever known," Jake told her one night, his voice low in the darkness. "Most would have given up long ago." "I couldn't," Nora replied simply. "Billy needed me to be strong." "And what about what you need?" he asked, turning to face her. The question hung between them, laden with meaning. Nora found herself unable to look away from his gaze, unable to deny the feelings that had been growing steadily since that first day in Sweetwater. "I needed," she began, then stopped, gathering her courage. "I needed someone to see me, not just as Billy's mother or Robert's widow, but as myself. I needed to not be alone anymore." Jake's hand found hers in the darkness, warm and calloused from hard work. "You're not alone now," he said softly. It was the closest they had come to acknowledging what was developing between them, this fragile, unexpected connection that neither had been looking for. The moment was broken by the sound of approaching riders. Jake was on his feet instantly, his hand going to the gun at his hip as he moved to place himself between Nora and potential danger. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice hard in a way she had never heard before. But Nora stood as well, retrieving the rifle that now stayed by the door. "This is my home, I won't hide." Jake's glance held equal parts frustration and admiration, but he didn't argue as three riders came into view in the moonlight. Nora's grip on the rifle tightened as she recognized Frank Sawyer and his men. "Well, well," Sawyer called, reining in his horse. "Quite the cozy scene. I heard rumors you'd taken up with Matthews' widow, Turner, but I didn't believe it until now." "State your business, Sawyer," Jake replied, his tone deceptively calm. "It's late for social calls." Sawyer dismounted, his movements betraying the effects of whiskey. "Just came to get Mrs. Matthews' answer to my generous offer. The week's up." "My answer is still no," Nora said firmly. "And now I suggest you leave. I've entered a partnership with Henry Blackwood of the Circle B. Any issues you have with my property can be discussed with him." Sawyer's face darkened at the mention of Blackwood. "That old man sticking his nose where it doesn't belong. This is between you and me, Mrs. Matthews." "Not anymore," Jake stepped forward. "Nora's made her decision. Respect it and ride out." For a tense moment, Sawyer looked as if he might argue further. His men shifted uneasily on their horses, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. "This isn't over," Sawyer finally spat, remounting his horse with less grace than usual. "Blackwood won't always be around to protect you. Neither will this drifter." "I'm not going anywhere," Jake said quietly, the simple statement carrying the weight of a vow. After Sawyer and his men had ridden away, Nora lowered the rifle, her hands shaking with delayed reaction. "He won't give up that easily." "No," Jake agreed, guiding her back to the porch steps. "But with Henry's backing and legal paperwork filed, there's not much he can do legally, and if he tries anything illegal." He left the implication hanging. Nora sat down heavily. "I've never had anyone fight for me before," she admitted. "After Robert died, it was just me against everything. Sometimes it feels like I've been fighting so long I don't know how to stop." Jake sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Maybe you don't have to stop fighting. Maybe you just need someone fighting alongside you for a change." The simple truth of his words brought tears to her eyes. "Is that what you're offering, Jake Turner? To fight alongside me?" In answer, he turned to her, his eyes silver in the moonlight. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned in and brushed his lips against hers, a question more than a demand. Nora answered by closing the distance between them, her hand coming up to rest against his chest, where she could feel the strong beating of his heart. The kiss deepened, years of loneliness dissolving in the warmth of human connection. When they finally parted, Jake rested his forehead against hers. "I've been running so long," he murmured. "Never thought I'd find someone worth staying for. And now?" Nora asked, echoing her question from days before. "Now I can't imagine being anywhere but here," he replied, his arms tightening around her. "With you and Billy, if you'll have me." The answer was in her eyes, in the way she drew him close again, in the tears that mingled with her smile. After so much loss and struggle, Life had brought her an unexpected gift in the form of a wandering cowboy with kind eyes and a heart big enough to love both her and her son. As summer turned to fall, the homestead flourished under the combined efforts of Nora, Jake, and the workers from the Circle B. The partnership with Henry Blackwood proved even more beneficial than anticipated, bringing stability and prosperity that Nora had only dreamed of during her years of struggling alone. Jake officially moved from the bunkhouse to the main cabin in late September, after a simple wedding ceremony performed by the circuit preacher. Billy, who had already taken to calling Jake Pa, when he thought no one was listening, stood proudly as best man, his small chest puffed out with importance. Frank Sawyer made one final attempt to cause trouble, filing a spurious claim against Nora's water rights, but Henry Blackwood's influence and the clearly documented legality of the Matthews homestead claim put a swift end to the matter. Shortly afterward, Sawyer sold his ranch and moved on to Wyoming territory, much to everyone's relief. Life settled into new rhythms for the Turner family, Jake and Billy working the land together, Nora expanding her vegetable garden into a proper market enterprise, the South Slope transforming as the first saplings of what would become a productive orchard took root. There were challenges, of course. Jake sometimes struggled with the responsibilities of fatherhood after so many years of answering only to himself. Nora had to learn to share decision-making after being solely responsible for so long. But their commitment to each other and to Billy saw them through the difficult adjustments. By the following spring, the homestead had been renamed Turner's Creek Farm, and the first phase of the orchard was thriving. When Nora discovered she was expecting a child, due in the fall, their happiness seemed complete. "Did you ever think we'd end up here?" she asked Jake one evening as they sat on the porch swing he'd built the previous summer. Her head rested against his shoulder, his hand absently stroking her hair as they watched Billy chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. "Not in my wildest dreams," Jake admitted, his other hand coming to rest on the gentle swell of her belly. "But now I can't imagine any other life." Nora smiled, covering his hand with her own. "All because you cleared a path for a desperate woman with a sick child. Best thing I ever did," Jake murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple, "leading me right where I was meant to be." As darkness fell, and Billy tired of his game, coming to nestle between them on the swing, Nora gazed out at the homestead that had once represented her greatest struggle, and now stood as testament to love's transformative power. From desperation to joy, from isolation to family, the journey had been unexpected but perfect in its own way. And as Jake's arm tightened around her shoulders, Nora knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them together, their love as enduring as the land they called home. On a bright October morning, with the orchard's first harvest safely gathered and the aspens turning gold against the azure sky, Nora gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah Rose Turner. Jake paced the yard with Billy during the labor, the boy's questions about his new sibling providing welcome distraction from the anxiety of waiting. When Henry Blackwood, now a frequent visitor and honorary grandfather to Billy, arrived with the midwife to announce mother and baby were doing well, Jake scooped his son into his arms and rushed inside to meet the newest member of their family. The sight of Nora, tired but radiant, holding their tiny daughter brought Jake to his knees beside the bed. "She's perfect," he whispered, gently touching the infant's wisp of dark hair, "just like her mother." Nora smiled, making room for Billy to climb carefully onto the bed for a closer look at his sister. "She has your eyes, I think," she said, as the baby blinked up at them with unfocused blue eyes. "Another girl with Matthew's courage and Turner's stubbornness," Henry chuckled from the doorway. Heaven help us all. The next years brought changes both expected and surprising. The orchard expanded, eventually becoming known throughout the territory for its exceptional fruit. Jake's natural talent for horsemanship led to a side business breeding and training quality stock, while Nora's preserves and baked goods became sought-after items at the Sweetwater General Store. Billy grew into a thoughtful young man with his mother's gentle spirit, and his stepfather's practical skills. Sarah, to no one's surprise, proved to be as adventurous and determined as both her parents, keeping them on their toes from the moment she could walk. When twins James and Robert joined the family 3 years after Sarah's birth, the Turner home had to be expanded to accommodate their growing brood. Jake and Henry spent months adding rooms and improving the original cabin, turning it into a proper farmhouse that rang with children's laughter and the warm sounds of family life. Frank Sawyer became little more than an unpleasant memory, though occasionally news would reach them of his failed ventures in Wyoming and later Montana. Jake sometimes reflected on how close Nora had come to losing everything to the rancher's greed, and how a simple act of kindness on a busy Sweetwater street had changed all their lives. "Do you ever miss it?" Nora asked him once on a rare quiet evening when the children were all asleep and they had the porch to themselves. The freedom of drifting, answering to no one, Jake considered the question honestly, as was his way. "Sometimes I miss the open country, the new horizons," he admitted. "But then I remember how empty those horizons were, how there was no one waiting, no one who cared if I came or went." His hand found hers, fingers intertwining with practiced ease. "I'd trade all the freedom in the world for one day with you and our children." It was all Nora needed to hear, the confirmation that the life they'd built together was as precious to him as it was to her. As Turner's Creek Farm prospered, so did the community around it. Henry Blackwood's influence and Jake's natural leadership saw improvements to the local school, better roads, and eventually a proper church building for Sweetwater. Nora, once so isolated, found herself at the center of a network of friends and neighbors, her kitchen often filled with visitors seeking her advice or simply her company. The years passed, marked by the seasons of planting and harvest, the milestones of their children's growth, the deepening of love between a man who had once been afraid to stay and a woman who had once been afraid to hope. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Jake surprised Nora with a trip to San Francisco, a 2-week adventure, while Henry and his wife looked after the children and the farm. It was the farthest either of them had traveled, and they reveled in the excitement of the growing city, the elegance of real hotels, and the luxury of time alone together. But when their train pulled into Sweetwater Station, and they saw their children waiting on the platform, Billy tall and serious at 16, Sarah a miniature of her mother at 9, the 7-year-old twins barely containing their excitement, they knew without words that the true adventure had always been here, in the life they had created together. "Welcome home," Billy said, taking their bags with the courteous strength that made Nora's heart swell with pride. "Home," Jake repeated, his arm around Nora's waist as they walked toward the wagon. "Best word in the English language." Nora leaned into his embrace, thinking of that desperate ride into Sweetwater so many years ago, of a feverish child and a stranger who had cleared a path through the crowd. How could she have known then that she was riding not just toward help, but toward the rest of her life? "The very best," she agreed, standing on tiptoe to kiss his weathered cheek. "And we're just getting started." As they climbed into the wagon for the familiar journey to Turner's Creek Farm, the setting sun painted the western sky in shades of gold and rose, promising another beautiful tomorrow for a family that had found its way home against all odds, guided by courage, sustained by love, and blessed beyond measure by the unexpected paths that had brought them together.